I was driving to the office this morning. I drive around a bit on Sunday mornings, and I got to thinking about this title, The Theory of Everything. And I thought, what kind of idiot would name a sermon series, The Theory of Everything? The best way to fail is to promise too much. It's like, I'm going to promise next week I'm going to teach you the meaning of life. So I thought maybe it's a bit of an overreach. But you know how I got to this? I preached on Easter Sunday morning, and I talked about the new film about Stephen Hawking, The Theory of Everything. And I said, look, there's only one theory of everything, and we find it here in the Bible. And so I've been thinking about doing this for a long time. I'm going to preach 4 sermons. We're not even going to get to Jesus for the most part. We're going to preach 4 sermons about what I call the architecture of faith. 4 biblical themes. We're going to start here in the first chapter of Genesis. We're going to finish in the next to last chapter of Revelation. Alpha to Omega, beginning to end. We're going to talk about 4 powerful themes and the architecture in which you and I make the decisions to build a life of faith. So it's an ambitious project, but I've been looking forward to it, and we're going to do our best. I'm going to read this morning from the first chapter of Genesis, just going to read part of it. I hope you'll go home. I read this last night, the first chapter, to my grandson, Liam. It only takes 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. I hope you'll go home and read all of it. We're going to read enough to make the point this morning. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from water swept over the face of the waters. A wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above it. And it was so. And God called the dome sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And it goes on and tells about the 7 days of creation. God says it's good. And then in the 26th verse, we'll skip to 26. Then God said, "Let us make humans in our own image." Note that. Let us make the human being in our image. That's why we're called the children of God. According to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created human beings in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." And it goes on and tells about the 6th and 7th day and how God said, "It is good." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We have a wonderful program in our church called Created by God. It's for 5th and 6th graders. A lot of you have had children or grandchildren go through this program. It's a sex education program, frankly. Teaches children very explicit information, but within the context of the Christian faith. Created by God. I love the name of that program because that's what it's all about, isn't it? The first responsibility of the church, and the most fundamental responsibility of the church, is to proclaim the good message that we are all created by God. 31 years I've been walking children up and down this aisle, baptizing them, and almost every time I've said, this is a child of God. It is the most fundamental thing that we teach our children, and we need to do it every morning, every night. And yet I'll have to say that if you're convinced that your child or grandchild understands that he or she is created by God, you might be somewhat deceived. I saw some information, some research 2 or 3 years ago that said this: the average preschooler sees 642 ads for breakfast cereal every year. If you're the mother of a preschooler, you probably know that because you've probably seen every one of them yourself. And so I think you and I would like to believe that our children and our grandchildren know that this is the most important fact about their lives, that they're a child of God. But I doubt that it's true. They know about the importance of choosing the right cereal, breakfast cereal. They know about the importance of choosing the right automobile, or dressing with the right clothes, or shopping at the right store. I just wonder how often the message falls off the radar that the most important thing about our children, or for that matter, the most important thing about you, is that you are a child of God. And so the Bible starts out just right, doesn't it? It starts out just right by telling us two things about God. That God created everything in the universe. And that God said, this is good. This is good. This is the most fundamental proclamation of who we are as Christians. And so what do we make of this message in this modern day? On the first day, the second day, in 7 days, God created everything. How do we understand that in today's world? Now, I'll tell you how I've always thought about this particular part of the Bible. We know that it began with oral history. It wasn't like it was written down from the very beginning. It began with oral history, probably thousands of years before the Bible was written. These old Hebrew nomads would move across the desert in the wilderness, camping out every night. And they'd sit around the campfires. And as the embers glowed, a little boy would look at the elder of the tribe and say, I have a question. Tell me how we got here. And the elder would look around at everybody around the fire and he'd say, well, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story. We know what stories are, don't we? We know exactly what stories are. Stories are meant to convey a truth that is bigger than the story itself. I tell stories in my sermons all the time, and each time the story is meant to tell a truth that's bigger and larger and more important than the story itself. We tell our children stories. We tell them about the boy that yelled wolf, or we tell them the story about the 3 little pigs. And of course we want them to remember the stories because they're cute, but the main thing we want them to remember is the story that is bigger than the story, the truth that is greater than the story itself. And so when I read a passage like this, I think about how Native American storytellers would often begin their stories around the campfire. The elder would rise and say, I'm not sure this is exactly how it happened, but I know that it's true. Because the truth of the story is bigger than the story itself. And so when we look at Genesis, there are a lot of ways to interpret this. You may be a person who chooses to read the Bible literally. You look at Genesis, you say God created this on the first day, the second day, the third day. You can choose to believe that God created the world in 7 24-hour days if you want to. I don't have any problem with that. But I'll tell you how I look at this story. I think the story tells us a story that's bigger than the story. It tells us that God created and God said it is good. And when I read about the theory of the Big Bang or the latest in astrophysics or cosmology, it just tells me that our understanding of the meaning of that story is expanding every single day. In the middle of the 17th century, a man by the name of Galileo discovered the telescope. It was amazing. He looked at the telescope and he discovered, of all things, that the sun is at the center of the solar system rather than the earth. That the solar system is heliocentric, what he called heliocentric, the sun at the center. The truth of the matter is that people had known that for 100 years. 100 years earlier, Copernicus, a mathematician, had figured this out mathematically. He knew it was true, but everybody had ignored it until Galileo discovered the telescope and people could look through it and see that it was true. That knowledge was so threatening to the church at the time, the Roman Catholic Church at the time, that Galileo was excommunicated. He was kicked out of the church. It was like the church couldn't handle the knowledge. It was like the Bible couldn't deal with new information. Living in a post-Copernican world was too difficult for them. Until the years passed and they discovered, guess what? All this tells us is that God was bigger than we thought. That's the way I look at scientific knowledge. I don't understand very much of it. The current understanding of the beginning of the universe is the Big Bang. I don't know how long that will last. Maybe that is the final scientific proclamation on the subject. But what it tells me is that the one who created the universe and said it is good is bigger than I could have ever imagined. The universe, 18 billion light years wide and expanding. What a big God it is that we worship. Let me tell you why I think this is important. It's important because of the decisions that you and I make about who we are, the faith decisions that shape who we become. You see, we live in a time, this is what I call this. We live in a time of malaise when it comes to American religion. You can see it all about you. We hear a lot about atheists and agnostics, but the truth of the matter is that what I observe is that most people just don't care very much. It is a time of apathy, and that maybe it's because people are simply confused. People just as soon be someplace else on Sunday mornings, and it could be because they're just confused. They hear these arguments. On the one hand, they hear religious people saying the world was created in 7 days. No such thing as evolution. On the other hand, they hear the definite proclamations of astrophysicists and cosmologists who say the Big Bang, it took place however many billions or trillion years ago. The world is 18.5 billion light years wide. And they don't know. They don't know. They're just confused. That's why it's important, because people, you see, I think a lot of people in our time have decided not to decide. Scientists say this, the theologians say this. I don't know, I'm confused. I'm just going to stay on the sidelines. And let me tell you what you already know. Not to decide is to decide. We learned that decades ago, didn't we? When I was in college, the civil rights movement, we learned that not to decide is to decide. I forget which philosopher said that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of crisis decide not to make a decision. And so in this most fundamental of all questions, the person who decides not to decide, who doesn't recognize that the decision to this is the most important decision in their lives, they'll remain in a kind of no man's land in which life just withers away. If you were here on Sunday morning, you heard me, Easter Sunday morning, you heard me say this. If you were here last Christmas Eve, at the 7 o'clock service, you heard me say this. Either God is or God isn't. It's not a multiple answer quiz. It's a true or false quiz. Either God is or God isn't. You may hear me say that every Sunday for the rest of my career because time is short. I look around America, I see churches dying, I see people confused, this kind of malaise about what it is they believe. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I just see the confusion and the malaise in America about the most fundamental things about our lives. And so it's important for us to say it. Either God is or God isn't. Either it's right or it's wrong. And you can choose not to make that decision for a while. You can be kind of a wanderer. You can say, I'm just not too sure, but ultimately, not to decide is to decide. And if you can make the decision, God isn't. You absolutely can make that decision. And when you make that decision, you can lead a life, an ethical life. You can lead a life that is full of integrity. You have a couple of philosophical approaches there. You can be a hedonist. You can say, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. Or you may choose some form of ancient Greek Stoicism, in which you say, it doesn't have any ultimate meaning or purpose, but I can live courageously in this life, facing the facts as they are. What you cannot do is live life with a transcendent vision of who you are and of the fact that God created you and said He is good. She is good. A life full of purpose and meaning that lasts long after the grave. Long after the grave. I've been reading David Brooks' new book, The Road to Character. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it. He talks about the kinds of inner decisions that great people make that help to build character. And it's all about these inner decisions. Lots of different stories, several different mini biographies in here. He talks about the decision that the arrogant or prideful person makes to become humble. The decision that the scared person makes to become courageous. There are a lot of different ways in which he illustrates the fact that great human beings who live powerful lives at some point stop and confront the decisions that they face on the inside. They make a decision and they begin to live and build a life of character. I'm concerned about building the life of faith. And it begins with this most fundamental question: either God is or God isn't. Either God created you and said you are good, or you are an accident of nature. And the way in which you answer that question, and it must be answered, will determine the way in which you live for the rest of your life. Several years ago, a friend of mine sent me a story that was written by the author Calvin Trillin. He told about going on an outing with his wife, Alice. She was doing volunteer work with an organization that works with special needs children, and they were going on a picnic out to a playground, and she said, would you like to go with me? He said, yeah, it's a beautiful day, I'll go with you. So they went to this place, they got on the bus, they all went to this playground. Alice was assigned the responsibility of looking after a little special needs child. And when they got in their place and they were sitting on a park bench, and the little child wanted to go off and play with the other children on some of the equipment, she turned and handed an envelope to Alice. And she said, would you hold this for me? And Alice said, well, of course I will. And the little girl went off to play. And Alice looked at this envelope. It wasn't sealed. And she kept looking at it, and the temptation just became too great for her. At one point, she took the envelope and opened it and pulled the letter out and read it. She turned to her husband, Calvin, and said, here, read this. It is the secret of life. And Calvin Trillin read it. This is what it said. It was a message from her parents. If God had given us the choice to choose amongst all the children in the world, we would have chosen you. And of course, that is the secret of life. Do you believe that God chose you? Do you believe that God created you, weaved you together, knitted you together in the womb of your mother, and gave you great gifts for the living of life in this world? If you believe that you are created by God, that is the first decision on the road to faith. And it will change your life forever.